Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next Service Genie webinar. Today, we're going to be talking with our solution specialist, Adrian Clark, and the topic is managing your engineers. So, effectively, today is going to be an extended look at some of the solutions that we provide and specifically relate them to, I guess, the frustrations and the conversations that we have with service-led businesses. So, kind of your colleagues and your peers and yourselves on a certainly a weekly, if not a daily basis. And if Adrian just flicks onto the next slide, we'll be able to see some of those common discussion points. And these are really just some bullet points, and I won't go through them all individually because there's too many. But if you have a read through yourself, you'll no doubt recognise some of those challenges, and no doubt some of them you will face too. So, as an example, we see third one down there, poor administration. That's something that we come across pretty regularly. People talking about the lack of a process, really. A lot of people still working with what we would call legacy systems or older technologies, might not be working in real time, which is another topic there. And in addition to that, the lack of the process just means that the actual gathering of the information, being able to react to that information, being able to report on that information just takes a little too long. Some others that are probably worth pointing out, having the right check sheets and assessments, and that can be in relation to check sheets associated with preventative maintenance work, but it can also be things as simple as equipment manuals or manuals associated with different models, and really giving the information at the coalface, as it were, to the engineer in the field. Another one that I always pick out because it comes up quite commonly is accessing historic information. So it sounds simplistic, but that is largely how engineers work a lot of the time, is referring back to work that's been done previously and calling up other engineers, which is fine, gets the job done quicker, but actually presenting people with that information is also really helpful. And that can be compliance documents as well as historical job information. So there's lots to get through today. So I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Adrian. And Adrian, welcome to today's webinar.
Hi, you well?
And Adrian, I'm going to pass over to you, and I think you're going to briefly just touch or begin with passing a job across to the mobile solution or our mobile software, and then we're going to look at the software itself and then see where it ends up at the end. So I guess it'll probably take about 20 or 30 minutes. I'm not as au fait with the solution as you are, so be prepared for some questions.
Yeah, not a problem as well. Okay. Hi everyone. Okay, so obviously the first thing when planning jobs, which is relevant really, is to have a look at what jobs that you've got open, assess where your engineers might be located, and then obviously give the right job to the right engineer, which in itself can be a bit of a task at the best of times. So looking at the desktop software in a program that we call Scheduler, there are essentially three screens in here. We have a job list, which you can see on the left-hand side, with various colors. These colors essentially relate to the status of a job. So, for example, you'd have jobs that are unissued, which are jobs you know about, but you haven't planned yet. Jobs that you have planned will be this lovely yellow color. And these are jobs that are in the diary, but they haven't been given to an engineer. So you can plan effectively an entire day or even a week, if you wish, for an engineer, but not actually give them the job, so they wouldn't be aware of them. We can also have then issued jobs which are blue, which obviously are on the engineer's mobile device. So it makes it kind of clear and easy for you to see the status of jobs and what's yet to be planned and other jobs that you've yet to deal with. Obviously, another aspect of issuing jobs to engineers is you obviously have skill sets, but location is an obvious one. So we pair the jobs with the map location, as you can see on the right-hand side here. So the first thing I might want to do, for example, is say, where are my jobs located? So if I have a look at the unissued jobs that I haven't planned, I can highlight these jobs, and then I can say, show them on the map. And that will then drop the pins in. It will allow me to see the jobs in a bit more detail, which is great. But then next, I really need to know where my engineers are currently. So using the icon here, I can also overlay my engineers so I can see where they are based on their current activity. And that's quite important, really, because engineers may be traveling or doing various tasks. What we actually do is geotag every event that happens on the mobile device. So you know, for example, when an engineer starts a job, where he was located when he actually began that work. So as you can see, I can now assess where my engineers are, what they're doing, and their location to jobs, for example. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this job here that I've got raised, and I'm going to drag that onto an engineer's timeline and essentially plan that job for that engineer. So I'm going to give this job to me here. It's telling me here that I've already got jobs open, and do I want to add a task to one of these jobs that are already open? But in this instance, I'm not going to do that, and it's asking me also if I want to change the date and time. So now that job is essentially planned in for me, but I don't actually have visibility of that on my mobile device. So what I'm going to do is just quickly bring up my mobile device here, so we can get a picture of that arriving on the device. And I simply click on the job, issue the job to the engineer, and that will now appear on the mobile device. As you can see, pretty much instantly. So moving across to the mobile device, it's tempting to put a lot of information in screens, but engineers really, their focus and their skill set lies with engineering. So they're used to fixing things and not necessarily being technical with computers, etc. So it needs to be accessible, and it needs to be really user friendly to make it easy for them to use. I think, as Gary mentioned earlier, it's really pivotal to make sure that you're getting the right quality of data in the system. And that really does begin and end with the engineers. They're at the coalface, they're collecting the data, and it needs to be done right. So to make the system as simple and easy to use as possible is absolutely imperative to making sure the rest of the system holds together.
We did, sorry, Agent, to interrupt, but it just reminds me, we did a podcast recently with an ex-engineer who was still in a service-led industry in a different role. But I remember him saying to us that in relation to just administration generally, or even technology, it's not the primary concern of the engineer. As an engineer, his primary concern was fixing the asset or servicing the asset, depending on what the job was. And that was his primary motivation and his focus. And actually the administration came secondary.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's a very good point. They're there really to fix the issue with the client's equipment and then move on to the next job. And anything you can do to make that much quicker and much more efficient ultimately is going to end up with a much happier customer, and usually happier engineers as well. So there's a few features that I'll bring your attention to that bring that information to the engineer to help them make more informed decisions and hopefully, improve first time fixes, and get the job done in a quicker time, and just make the whole day much more effective and efficient for them. So there's a lot to go through here. So what we'll start doing we'll start having a look at is the sub menu up here on the top right hand side, because there's a few nice features in here which you don't have to have depending on the business that you run, because not all features are suitable for all engineers or for all businesses. But it is obviously worthwhile pointing them out, because there will be some people that might use these particular aspects. So, for example, you could allow an engineer to book holiday or sick leave from the mobile device. Engineers typically tend to be spread around the country, so they're not always in the office. So it helped from an admin perspective. Likewise, you could also allow engineers to raise jobs on the mobile device. It is quite common when engineers are on site that a customer will say, whilst you're here, could you just take a look at this, because I've got a problem with this other piece of equipment. Now, what typically tends to happen is the engineer might do it under the radar because there's no set process in place. So they'll end up doing work for free. And ultimately that's great for the customer, but from a business perspective, you have no record of that work being done, or you're not capturing any actual costs. So Also, if you work 24/7 and you don't necessarily have people manning the office, you can forward the on-call number to the engineer and they can raise their own jobs themselves. But ultimately what you're doing is you're capturing that information on site, and then you're building the right data out as well, which is useful. Similar to that, they can also raise quotes. So if you have the right processes in place, you can actually allow an engineer to create a simple job quotation on his mobile device. Now, again, not necessarily suitable for everybody, but we do have checks and balances in place. So it's almost identical to raising a job. Obviously, you can put parts on. You can also add images and the requested amount of labour. But what will actually happen is that will ultimately go back to the desktop software, and it will notify somebody in the office that a quotation has been raised. That they can actually then check that quote, make sure they're happy with it, and then email that directly to the customer, which is also quite useful. We also allow engineers to message back to the office. So at any time, if you want to, you can message one or multiple engineers in one time. We have an inquiry feature as well, which allows the engineer to pull data from the server and look at a lot of other information about that customer. So it could be other equipment, it could be open quotes, job history on other pieces of equipment. This specific function does require internet connectivity, but it is probably the only thing on here that does. Almost all of the data, if it's on the mobile device before the engineer arrives on site, he doesn't need internet connectivity whatsoever. So they can work all day long without having to have internet. And as soon as they roam into an internet-enabled area, all the data will synchronize with the server. The day summary essentially just tells me what that engineer's done. So as I mentioned before, it's activity-based. So essentially what happens is when the engineer logs on in the morning, it will then ask them what their next activity is. So as you can see at the moment here at the bottom, I'm working on job 250. So that's automatically booking time to that job. But every time I change my activity, the system asks me again, what am I doing next? Am I traveling to a job? Am I going on a break? And the system will capture that time accurately. And it will also geotag his location, so you know exactly where the engineer was at that particular point in time.
So we're creating a timesheet there, aren't we, Adrian?
Absolutely, exactly. So essentially, that will make sure that the time that is captured throughout the day is also then flushed into his timesheet, so you don't need to have anyone in the office creating that timesheet, which actually can be quite time consuming. It also encourages the engineers to use the system effectively if they know their time is going to ultimately have some kind of effect on the wage at the end of the month. Now we have a couple of new features in here as well. We have a pick, pack and dispatch feature, which obviously if you sell parts or you need to prepare parts for engineers, vans or for specific jobs, you can, in the main system, you can actually create a reservation for parts, link them to jobs or sales orders, and then you can use the mobile device then to go through that entire pick, pack and dispatch process, ensuring that everything is all tied in together, which is really useful. And last but not least, we have expenses. So if your engineers are out on the road or a week, for example, or on a long project, it's quite likely they will incur costs for lunches, hotel stays, or even hiring equipment, cherry pickers, etc. Then you can actually create the expense request from the mobile device and also link it to a specific job if required. And then that will also then apply the costs to that job. And again, giving you a very accurate sort of revenue cost analysis for a specific job. So moving down into the job list, these are the jobs that the engineer has on their mobile device currently. Now, there are technically two types here. We have a job with a single task, which you can see here. But you can also have multiple tasks on a job. So an example of that would be if you're going on site to do a service of more than one piece of equipment, you can drag and drop the entire job onto an engineer's list, and all of the subsequent tasks will then go to the mobile device. So here you can see we've got one job, but there's 2 assets that I need to service on site. And then we also have mapping functionality in here as well. So you can see the location, or you can use the built-in SatNav software to navigate to that particular job if you need to. So the header information of the job just gives an engineer a heads up of essentially where he's going and what he needs to do. Obviously, you can contact the customer should they need to. They can log into the job. And as you can see here, it's asking me if I want to set my next activity. So if I say I'm traveling to the job, that will start the clock ticking, and it will keep an accurate time until the engineer arrives on site and then says, I'm now working on that job. We have a list of icons at the top, which are basically pages. So we'll go through these in order. But on the main details page here, we can see the customer's information. We could ring the customer if we wish, or we could edit some of the job details. We can see the reason why we're going to this particular location. So we're going to do a service and what the priority is, high priority, etc. What type of job we're going to do, and the required dates and time. So when the job was raised, what the target date and time is, and what date and time we ultimately agreed with the customer. If there were any documents attached to this job, we could access them here, or we could add them. We can also see if there's any engineers sharing this job or task with us. So you can, and this does quite often happen, you'll have, maybe an engineer go out and an apprentice, or it might be a 2-man job. So essentially, both engineers can log onto that job on their mobile device, and they can both add parts, they can both put labour, they can both put notes, and all of that data is captured on the one job, but on the 2 devices if required. Other bits of information is the actual location. So within a site, it might be a very large site, so you may have locations, and this particular piece of equipment, as you can see, is in Hangar 1. And then importantly, any site notes, because quite often when you go on site, there might be certain things that you have to be aware of. So I can see here that I must wear a high visibility jacket and carry my ID at all times. And then at the end here, just a bit more useful information. Because this is a service, it's telling me these are the parts that I would require to do a service, either a major or a minor service. These are the number of these parts I have on my van. These are the number of parts that are available at the depot. And this is the quantity of parts I'm going to require to do each one of these services, and then other parts that might be related to that piece of equipment at the bottom. If we move along to the equipment tab, then obviously we get much more information about that specific piece of equipment that we're actually going to attend. So we can see things like next service dates, etc. Also, we can change the piece of equipment that's on this job. And this is something in my time of talking to service companies that happens quite a lot. You may have lots of the same asset on that site. So it's quite common for the job to either be raised on the wrong piece of equipment, or they don't know which piece of equipment it is, and therefore you can raise the job on the site. When the engineer actually gets to site, if they find that they need to change the piece of equipment on the job, then they can easily do that here. They can also view documents for this particular piece of equipment as well. So they can see the actual specific documents for the piece of equipment, but they can also see models, documents that are related to that particular model. So these are documents that can be changed model-wide. So you don't have to change documents for every piece of equipment with that model number. For example, if the manufacturer changes the specification or something of that nature. So all of these documents are then available to the engineer on site. Obviously, job history. And again, one of the things that can be quite frustrating for engineers is not knowing what's happened to that piece of equipment previously. So within the system, they can easily find all the previous jobs and drill into it and find out, has this particular issue happened before? How did somebody else fix it? What parts did they use, etc. And there's a parts history section here as well. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, Adrian, look at that. That all looks absolutely fantastic. And one of the things that strikes me, though, and I think you did touch on it earlier, is there's a lot of there's some options in there that I think I'd be pretty confident in saying, again through my experience of talking with various service-led industries, is They might not want all of this kind of functionality. Is a lot of it what we would class as configurable? Can you turn functions on and off if you decide, well, actually, I don't want the engineers to be able to have that level of autonomy in choosing what to do and what not to do?
Well, absolutely, yes, you're right. I've had very similar experiences myself. It is quite common for people to not want engineers to change or add pieces of equipment in the field. So there are quite a few areas within the software where either we can set up specific for a customer, or the customer can add or remove certain bits of functionality themselves, because ultimately the system has to be configurable around the way that company works. Otherwise, it means they have to bend their processes, and it can be quite frustrating. And a good example of that is being able to edit the equipment details, for example. So, for instance, it's quite common for people to want to be able to add barcodes to pieces of equipment. So you can actually go up and you can apply a barcode to a piece of equipment, scan it, and it will then allocate that barcode to that particular asset. But you're right, yes, it's not always sensible to have all functionality available. Okay, so now the engineer knows where he's going, what he's going to do. He can have a look at the piece of equipment and obviously assess what's happened previously. When they come on to actually completing the work, it can be straightforward, i.e. they're just fixing what's wrong and then adding parts and moving on. But other jobs can be more complex. Therefore, there might be the requirement for things like a service tick sheet. And they can be very different, I guess. So you could, for example, have a detailed report, or you could just have a very simple service tick sheet. In this instance, the job has brought up a specific tick sheet for me to complete. But if it's not appropriate, then what I can actually do at that point in time is say, well, okay, this is the sheet that I've got. I don't actually need to do that one, so I can remove it. But I do need to do, I don't know, a basic calibration or something different. So within the mobile device, the engineer can see tests that are associated with that asset, or they can access every other test that's in the system, and then they can choose the appropriate one for that particular visit. So, for example, if I just put on a vehicle checklist, it's telling me it's not associated with it, but that's fine. I can save that, and I can now add that to this piece of equipment. So now I can go through and I can either add the results or tick the boxes to say, yes, I've done this, or do a condition rating, or even do basic calibrations. So some can be very basic, but some can be much more complex, and it really is up to you how you want those to work. So if I just quickly fill all these details in, and then save that. And as you can see, it will tell you if you haven't filled in all the details correctly. So I do need to put my mileage in here. And then it will obviously let me complete that. And that's a very important point, actually. It's one thing having these documents on the device, but as people will know, it's quite common for engineers to just skip through certain bits if they don't want to do it. And again, ensuring that the data is, has full integrity, you need to be able to make certain things mandatory. You can actually create these check sheets yourself, and you can state within those which elements the engineer has to fill in, and the system won't let them progress through the check sheet or complete the job if they haven't actually filled in those required fields. That does make the data much more accurate.
Yeah, that's going back to what we kicked off with when we were looking at some of the common discussion points. Was, I think the first one I mentioned was people talking about poor administration or lack of a process, and I think you've very much addressed that there, haven't you? In that, not only can we create, in essence, a workflow, which is what we're doing with these documents, but by making fields mandatory to complete, we're actually ensuring that the administration is up to the level that it should be. It's not left to interpretation or left to engineers that may be more conscientious than others. Actually, this is the process and you can't proceed without it. That's effectively what we're saying here, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it ensures that obviously the job is done correctly and the data as well, is accurate, essentially. But you can create these within Service Genie yourself, and they can be linked to specific types of equipment. But you can also create the document that is ultimately sent to the customer. So that could be the job sheet, or it could be a service sheet, or it could be a certificate of some description. All of that is configurable by the customer. Obviously, then moving on to parts, during the process of fixing something, typically you'll use a part or two. Now, there are two different types of parts in the system currently. We have a miscellaneous item. So these are parts that you wouldn't necessarily have on your van. So you may need to go to a local store in order to purchase a particular part for this particular job. That's where it can link nicely in with the expenses if you're going to buy a part specifically for a job. But then obviously, most engineers tend to have van stock available. So if I add a part in the stock part section, I can see the parts that I have on my van. I can see if you've set up bin locations, which bin location in the van that part is, and also the quantity I have available. But you can also interrogate the depot or the branch stock as well, if you don't have that on your van. So you could make a quick trip to the depot, get that part, and come back and finish that job. Ultimately ensuring you're getting the first time fix, which is really quite important. So I'm just going to put one of these parts on here. So as you can see, that's now on the job. Incidentally, all of this data, as long as there's internet connectivity, it replicates real time to the desktop software. So as soon as the engineer does something on the mobile device, that becomes visible to the people back in the office. So then we come on to the labour. So as you can see here, I have a couple of entries of labour that I've previously done for this particular job. So a couple of sections of travel time. It would show me if it was another engineer, so I can see if other people have booked time to this job. But currently, there's 2 entries of labour that I've done previously. But at the bottom here, to the second, it's counting my current time on this job.
Adrian, on that, just looking at the information, I know it's a demonstration, but looking at the data you've got there, and you were quite precise there in saying that it's to the second. So what that actually raises, in question that it raises for me is, if you're on site for 32 minutes and 30 seconds, is that what the customer sees? Because a lot of the people that we deal with, they would have maybe a minimum an hour's labor as a minimum for a call out, or they might charge in blocks of 30 minutes or 15 minutes. How does that impact what the customer sees, or what you charge the customer?
Well, again, this is really down to what the customer wants to, how they want to set the system up, and what's ultimately appropriate for their business. As we mentioned earlier, the accurate time is captured, and therefore that builds a timesheet in the background for the engineer, which is to the second accurate. But that's not always appropriate, as you mentioned. So within the system, the charge code that's used for this particular job, I can add a flag that says round the working or travel time up to, say, the nearest 5, 10 or 15 minutes, for example. So what that essentially would do is, if I've been working on a job for 55 minutes, it will round the billable time up to the full hour. So essentially, the engineer's timesheet and the job time will be accurate, showing 55 minutes. However, the time that's billed to the customer will be the full hour.
Yeah,
and that would give me a much more accurate idea of my true cost on that job.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, because you're only putting the cost of the actual labor associated with it, but you're displaying to the customer, certainly from a billable time point of view, whatever whatever you've agreed with them. I guess whatever the contract is, that if you bill in blocks of 15 minutes, so if you're there for 50 minutes, you charge him for 60.
Correct. That's absolutely spot on. You can also associate the engineer's actual hourly rate to that job and that cost code also. So you can set a default rate as a cost. So you bill out, say, £20 an hour, but the engineer costs you £10 an hour. But if you associate an actual rate to that engineer, because you may have people on different salaries, or a time served versus apprentice, it will use their specific rate for the costs. And that will give you a much more accurate idea of that cost again. And I'll show you an example of that when we go back to the desktop software shortly. So the job's complete. Then all that's left is for the engineer to enter what they've done. So I can now put in completed, for example. Keep it quite simple. So the job is complete. I have an option here as well if I want to make this public or private. So I could, for example, add the first note as private, but then any other subsequent notes as public. So essentially the public notes will end up on the job sheet for the customer, but everything else the customer won't see, will only see back in the office. I have a number of icons as well here, so I can attach documents to this job. So if you have a smart piece of equipment that can, say, link via Bluetooth to a mobile device, it might export a CSV file or something of that nature with some running data for that piece of equipment. So I could attach that to this job. Alternatively, if I've already taken pictures, I can add those. Or, as I'm going to do in this instance, I can take a picture with the mobile device, give it a name, take the required picture, save that. But what I can do now is I can actually annotate this image. So, for example, I can put various stamps on and then add the data at the bottom. And then further annotate this image if I wish to bring more attention to a specific part or area, as you can see. And I'm going to add that as public. Those images either can be made visible to the customer in the web portal with a click of a button, so the customer can see various pictures from jobs. Alternatively, they can actually be added to the job sheets or service sheets in various sections. So all of that data, all of the images, all of the annotation, all of that could be made available to the customer if required. And again, we come back when we're completing the job to some other areas that you may or may not want to make available for your specific working process. So we can report on a first time fix, for example, which then will allow you to have KPIs for a customer to see how effective that you've been. And then we can add, in this instance, it's asking me for equipment hours, running hours. But again, this could be customer definable, and it could be temperature reading, it could be number of journeys or something of that nature. You can actually trigger services based on this running time as well. So, for example, if a piece of equipment reaches 1,000 hours, the system will then generate a service automatically to go and complete the next job on that piece of equipment. So I'm going to complete this task. I can review this data with the customer, then I can confirm, and then obviously I can have the customer sign, and the customer can also then rate the satisfaction of the job. If the customer says they're not happy with the job, somebody in the office will get a notification, and they can then take some kind of action and speak to the customer to find out why they were or weren't happy. So I'm going to rate this one as poor. The engineer can then sign the job off, and then that's the job completed. Obviously, as I mentioned before, because it's activity based, it's now asking me for my next activity. And again, it will geotag that event. So I'm going to say, I'm going to go on a break, and then that's it, my job's done. So in the back office, these jobs will now turn green. All of the data will come back and they will link to this job. And then the required documents will go to the customer automatically. So we can then drill into a job and have a look at the detail. So if we drill into a job, we have a full revenue cost analysis for this particular job. We can see the margins that we've got on the travel, on the parts, on the labor. We can also see all of this information in detail here, should we wish. We can get an overview of everything that's done, and if there's multiple tasks, we can expand this and we can have a look at that detail. And incidentally, we can edit any of this information. When the information comes back from the engineer, I quite often get asked, does it go directly to the customer? Is the job just invoiced? No, it's not. Essentially, we have a submit process, which is this basically, and it allows somebody of authority to check all the detail and make sure that that job is now appropriate to invoice. So we do have KPIs at the bottom, so we can see things like the first time fix rate and response time, etc. We can overview any parts. We can get an idea of, you know, the margin on those. We can see the time that's been booked to the job. We can view the tests. We can look at the work done and see the images, etc. Quotes, which there won't be any on this. See these jobs and attach these to the customer web portal, and then again we're right back to the financial data. And that's essentially it from beginning to end.
Well, that's great, Adrian. I've definitely learned something there today. So thank you for sharing that. And I think if we go back to where we started, I think I was kind of ticking them off in my head as we were working through the demonstration and seeing where we were addressing all of those different points. And I think we absolutely did. So I think that's been really valuable. If you want to share any questions or any insights as to how you work, or you want to have a chat with us about anything that we've discussed or shown you today, then please get in touch. I know both myself or Adrian would be delighted to chat to you. If you want more information, the webinar will be available again offline. And if you would like to chat to us, you can find our details at the website, which is servicegenie.com. We will see you again very shortly with another webinar. If we don't see you before then, I hope everybody that's watching has a lovely Christmas. Hopefully that won't age too badly for someone watching it in January. And we'll see you all again soon. Thank you, Adrian, for your input too. It was very valuable.
You're welcome. Take care.